Many of Donald Trump's most corrupt cabinet members have now been forced out of their jobs after months and months of the administration attempting to protect them. The most recent exit, of course, was the wildly corrupt administrator of the Environmental Protection Agency, Scott Pruitt, who was and is under more than a dozen official federal investigations at this point. Similarly corrupt, at least it seems to me, but receiving much less attention for reasons I'm not altogether clear about, is Trump's Interior Department Secretary, Ryan Zinke. But new information and a new story and a frankly massive foul-up by the Department of Interior seems like it should help bring more scrutiny to the role that Zinke appears to be playing for commercial industry rather than for the public as the head of Interior. As you'll recall, in April of this year, President Donald Trump signed an executive order instructing Interior Department Secretary Ryan Zinke to review 27 national monuments established over 21 years, arguing that his predecessors had overstepped their authority in placing these large sites off limits to commercial development. Since then, as we have reported here on the Bradcast and, of course, in our Green News Report, in an unprecedented move for any president, Trump has significantly reduced the size of two of Utah's largest national monuments. That would be Bears Ears and Grand Staircase Escalante, and has not ruled out altering, limiting, closing down still more public lands, allowing them to be used by commercial drilling, mining, and ranching interests. But in their quest to shrink national monuments, Washington Post's Juliet Alperin was the first to report recently, senior Interior Department officials dismissed evidence that these public sites boosted tourism and spurred important archaeological discoveries, according to documents and that the department released last month, but then retracted and redacted a day later. The thousands of pages of email correspondence before they were retracted and redacted for public release chart how Interior Secretary Ryan Zinke and his aides tailored their survey of protected sites to emphasize the value of logging, ranching, and energy development that would be unlocked if they were not designated as national monuments. The new documents reveal that as Zinke conducted his 4-month review, Interior officials rejected material that would justify keeping protections in place and sought out evidence that could buttress the case for unraveling those protections. Many of those points, the points underscoring the need to keep public lands protected, were subsequently redacted for release under Freedom of Information Act requests, but only after the initial unredacted portions were made available accidentally to journalists. As the Salt Lake Tribune's Brian Maffley reports, the unredacted documents from Interior are very revealing, as are the redactions of specific portions of those documents. Maffley explains that southern Utah's Grand Staircase Escalante National Monument has helped shield archaeological sites from vandalism, bolstered tourism, and spurred scientific discovery during the 2 decades since its designation, all without displacing cattle operations that have long used these public lands. That's what the Bureau of Land Management wrote in a report released in July. The next day, however, the agency released redacted documents and that downplayed those benefits, and in doing so painted a picture that the monument might not be necessary to protect the resources within its nearly 2 million acre boundaries. Maffley quotes Aaron Weiss of the Center for Western Priorities, noting that, quote, "You have the secretary being worried if you get rid of the national monument protections in Grand Staircase Escalante, you will be leaving sacred Native American sites unprotected. And there is no way to replace those protections with the existing patchwork of laws." Weiss notes they were really clear about that, and then they tried to hide that from the American people in the document dump. Critics, of course, contend that the redactions were made because the material undermined Interior's rationale for shrinking monuments, and offer proof that the outcome of Zinke's Monument Review was preordained with an eye toward mineral extraction on land struck from the Grand Staircase and Bears Ears National Monuments. Acting on Zinke's recommendations last year, Donald Trump reduced the Grand Staircase by about half and Bears Ears by some 85%, sparking a host of lawsuits from tribal, environmental, and scientific groups. Here to explain all of this, and specifically, pardon the pun, the monumental screw-up by Ryan Zinke's Interior Department, what they were trying to hide and what this may mean for those lawsuits moving forward, not to mention Trump's other threatened closures and reductions of national monuments, is Aaron Weiss. He is the media director, blogger, and podcaster for the Center for Western Priorities, a nonpartisan conservation and advocacy organization promoting responsible policies and practices and working to ensure accountability at all levels to protect public land, water, and communities in the American West. By the way, before joining CWP, Aaron spent 14 years as a journalist and broadcast news producer, escaping that nightmare apparently just in time. And he now also hosts CWP's Go West Young podcast, focused on public lands and the outdoors. Aaron West, welcome to the Bradcast, sir.
Brad, thank you very much for having me. It is my pleasure to be here.
Before we talk about some of the specifics in these documents that the Interior Department subsequently at least tried to redact, I know that you guys do a lot of FOIA requests at the Center for Western Priorities, and you watch these document dumps closely. What exactly happened here in, as I called it, this monumental screw-up by Interior?
The short version is that someone just forgot to hit the right button at the end here. You put out FOIA responses using Adobe Acrobat, and stuff that's supposed to get redacted, you use the redaction tool inside Acrobat, and once you're done, you hit the finally redact button, and they forgot to do that here. So what they ended up posting was the full documents, not just unredacted, but you could see both the stuff they were intending to redact and all of the comments they left along the way about why they were redacting them. So it almost would have been even better, for them if they just posted the whole thing without the attempted redactions. But you actually got to see inside the redaction process. So it was a monumental, pardon the pun, screw up.
Yeah, it sure was. The key parts that were redacted from these particular documents, we now know, regards Grand Staircase Escalante, which was designated a national monument by Bill Clinton back in 1996, and detailed, among other things, Native American artifacts that were discovered at Grand Staircase. Since then, they talk about hundreds of cultural sites being inventoried. That was among the material that was redacted. What possible reason would they have for redacting that information?
So the reason they gave, what showed up in the final redacted document once they took it down and reposted it, they called that section deliberative process. So under the Freedom of Information Act, you're allowed to redact certain things: private information, phone numbers, email addresses, medical information, obviously. That's all proper. But then you also have this very broad exception. It's called the B5 deliberative process exemption. And it's supposed to be so that officials can discuss policy options candidly, without worrying about their internal deliberations going out to the public.
Right.
But oftentimes we see that B5 redaction being used as what's called the because I want to redaction.
Right.
And that's exactly what happened here, is because they wanted to redact stuff that just didn't look good for them, they called that stuff deliberative, even though many of these sections were not discussing policy options. They were just basic facts. And that's what you shouldn't be able to delete and call deliberative. Instead, they just crossed out this whole section.
Yeah, you shouldn't be able to. But of course, we wouldn't have even known about that had they released the documents redacted in the first place. We would have presumed that the redactions was that deliberative stuff you're you're talking about. But in fact, as I say, it notes hundreds of cultural sites have been inventoried, and yet only 7% of the total area of Grand Staircase Escalante has yet to be surveyed. Are these unsurveyed sites the ones that will no longer be protected with the Trump Zinke shutdown of about half the monument?
Well, yeah, so it's about half the monument. So, huge sections that have not yet been surveyed by archaeologists and paleontologists. And that's one of the ironies here is that Grand Staircase is very rich in paleontological resources. It's relatively rich in those cultural artifacts in the cultural landscape. But compared to Bears Ears is a treasure trove of archaeological and cultural artifacts. And we know that inside Bears Ears, there are tens of thousands of archaeological sites that are in the area that President Obama protected. And again, that whole inventory was still in process. Bears Ears was only on the books for about a year before President Trump attempted to rescind that and shrink it by an even bigger amount. So when you extrapolate out from what we know that he was being warned at Grand Staircase, we know he must have been getting similar warnings about Bears Ears, and it's maybe an order of magnitude bigger in terms of the risk to the Native American archaeological sites there inside Bears Ears.
Now, not redacted, Aaron Weiss, from these documents was information on mineral deposits in these monuments, tar sands, coal, etc. Looking at these documents and the subsequent attempted redactions here, what does this tell us? It seems like it tells a pretty clear story about why the Trump administration is doing what they are doing here with these attempted reductions, no?
It does. We'd always suspected that the outcome was preordained, but this really makes it crystal clear that the fix was in from the beginning. And we haven't talked about marine monuments on here, but there are some email exchanges about fishing in the marine national monuments that are even more explicit about getting rid of statements and facts that undercut their case for trying to reopen the marine monuments, both in the Pacific and the Atlantic, to commercial fishing. And there's one amazing exchange where you see them realize that if they lifted the ban on commercial fishing inside Rose Atoll National Monument in the Pacific, it wouldn't make a difference because there's a broader ban on large boat fishing in an area larger than Rose Atoll. And it's like you can hear the sad trombones going off in their heads in this email exchange when they realize what they wanted to do won't actually make a difference because of other protections.